The purpose of this series is to provide an overview of select vintage and modern games, their pros, their cons, and what are the essential books and items that you need to play them. With different editions, multiple games appearing to be similar on the surface, and a huge variety of supplements and expansions, newcomers, and even some veterans, can often find it daunting and a confusing place to be. This series hopes to lend a helping hand. As I've mentioned elsewhere on this channel, and within this series of videos, my entry into the world of role-playing games was with a certain series of little black books. We've already covered the first and second instalments of this particular game, the science fiction forge of an epic star wandering that is Traveller. Now it is time to delve into its third edition from 1993, and why it is, big spoiler, my favourite edition to date. Today, we strap on our favourite salvaged fusion rifle, or, as we like to call it, antivirus with menaces, and head out into the wilds to liberate another post-Imperium world from the grip of a dangerous Ted. Today, we jump into Traveller, the new era. I'm always in two minds when a new edition of a game I play is released. I tend to evaluate based on a few factors. How much investment in the previous editions I have made? Does the new edition bring any improvements or interesting new concepts to the table? To what extent does it invalidate game material I own? And timing. Timing is an important one for me. If a new edition comes along inside a decade of the previous one, it better come along with some pretty shiny baubles. In my opinion, Traveller the New Era, released in 1993, did just that. But first, let's jump back a bit to 1984. In this year, Game Designers Workshop published a role-playing game describing a post-World War III world, named Twilight 2000. We will delve into this game in more detail in another video, so for now we will just focus on the elements of it relevant to our subject at hand here. For the purpose of our discussion, it is enough to note that Twilight 2000 and GDW's more popular game, Traveller, shared some common themes within their rules, and diverged in others. A second edition of Twilight 2000 was released in 1990. Major changes here included shifting the system away from a percentile basis and introducing character development through generated experience, rather than a point-buy system. These changes will become important later on in our essay. By this time, GDW had a number of role-playing games, published or in development. These included Traveller, of course, along with 2300 AD, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, Dark Conspiracy, Space 1889, and Twilight 2000. A decision was made to bring all of the GDW role-playing games going forward into the same rule structure. This would make these games easier to maintain and would enable GDW to explore themes and settings with more focus, and would make all of their role-playing games compatible with each other. The idea of a generic set of company rules upon which lots of different things could be constructed was not a new one by this point. Steve Jackson Games had been doing this for some years with GURPS, and Chaosium had constructed a number of games on the foundation of the BRP system, for example. This project reached fruition with the release of Twilight 2000 version 2.2 and Traveller: The New Era, both released in 1993. These releases brought both games onto the same foundation, which was basically the second edition Twilight 2000 rules, and tweaked them to bring them in line with each other. Yes, this did mean that version 2.2 Twilight 2000 sourcebooks, and with some level of tweaking, version 2 sourcebooks, could be used with Traveller: The New Era within a tech level 8 or 9 environment. Away from the core rule foundation, little else changed as far as those rules specific to Traveller. World generation was still very recognisable, collating most of the extensions published by GDW for their earlier Mega Traveller rules into a single volume core for the new era. Also present in this hefty tome, in comparison to the 96 to 104 norm for Mega Traveller books, the 384 pages of the new era core book was hefty indeed, were all the general rules that you'd need: character generation, world building, task resolution, personal, vehicle and space combat, encounters and equipment, including core starship designs. In fact, perhaps the only core elements missing were the design rules for vehicles, starships and other items, and the reason for this would become clear. But before we get into that, let's go into the setting background elements that also contributed to that impressive page count. Traveller had, at least across its 2 incarnations so far, established a trend of pushing the timeline of the core setting forward with each new version. With the last Mega Traveller releases, we had seen a setting in decline, with worlds degrading or even dying as interstellar trade diminished. With a war of attrition collapsing under no clear victor, the setting of the Third Imperium had entered hard times indeed. Within this scope, we had reached the imperial year of 1128, both within the Hard Times sourcebook and the campaign adventure Arrival Vengeance. In the back of that latter work, released in 1992, the future of Traveller was announced. Farewell. This is the last Mega Traveller product that GDW will publish. The next product in the 15-year-old Traveller line will be Traveller: The New Era, in the early spring of 1993. This will be a new edition of the Traveller game, taking it in directions it has never gone before. This also had ramifications for Digest Group Publications, who had managed the Mega Traveller line throughout its run. If you have been following my Traveller review videos to date, you already know the fondness that I have for the materials DGP pushed out, both under their own and under GDW's banner. In particular, the Mega Traveller Journal, of which 1993's final instalment, Issue 4, is something I very much cherish. Within this issue, however, the Helm Report, the magazine's editorial, announced DGP's position in a post-Mega Traveller world. This issue of the journal is to be DGP's last Traveller product. Yes, you heard right. We're not going to support Traveller after this. This is it. From now on, we're going to pour all of our attention and loving care into our new game, AI. As much as we love Traveller, and we're true fanatics about the game, we've decided to no longer support the game with GDW's release of Traveller: The New Era. There are lots of reasons for this, the most significant being our desire to control a game's direction ourselves. GDW owns Traveller. We don't. And believe me, we have asked GDW if they would ever consider selling the rights to the game to us, but we've always got a firm and definite no. If, from that passage, you're wondering, what about this AI game then? Well, it never came out. After getting out of the Traveller business, another quote from issue 4, DGP found themselves in financial difficulties. An individual named Roger Sanger bought much of the assets of DGP from 1994, including the company, but was unable to do much with it. And so DGP entered limbo. Of the talented writers that worked on Mega Traveller, some came aboard with GDW for the new era, some wandered off into different careers, and Joe Ficati, DGP's founder and leading light, now heads up the Model Railroad Hobbyist magazine. So where were we? All right, 1128. The new era picks up in the year 1201, leaving a gap of over 70 years to fill between the two games. The core book goes into some of this, but the real meat on the bones of the what happened comes in the form of Survival Margin, Gateway to the New Era. This is one of my favourite lore-leaning works of the entire Traveller canon. It leads us from the outbreak of the rebellion of Mega Traveller in 1116, right up to Archduke Dulanor's unfortunate death by Combine in 1130, to the accidental release of Lucan's secret weapon from Research Station Omicron. This progression of history is largely presented within Survival Margin as Traveller News Service entries, with a handful of illustrating maps. This is a great way of showing Traveller history in general, as it allows multiple viewpoints on the issue to be explored. I have a collected version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles that does something similar, by printing entries from different chronicles for the same years close to each other for ease of reference and comparison. In this way, the different perspectives of, for example, those chroniclers who were pro and anti the invasion of William the Conqueror can be viewed together. David Nilsson, the author of Survival Margin, does something similar here. By using TNS to present this history, it also allows the narrative to be told in an in-game way. This adds to the flavour and enjoyment of the work, and also enables the results of Lucan's secret weapon to be directly shown. The only defence is to cease all communications, shut all systems down, receive no messages, further... Of course, those that already know what Lucan's weapon is will understand that for anyone receiving this particular emergency bulletin from TNS, it was already too late. And so we come on to that secret weapon, which seems to be the central cause for concern for a lot of people that I have spoken with about this particular edition of Traveller. That is, virus. From a lore perspective, virus is a large part of the canvas upon which the default 1201 setting of the game is painted. The release of virus hastened the slow collapse of the Imperium under hard times to an almost overnight affair, in this case overnight being subject to the speed of communication that has always been part of charted space as a menu. Virus destroys the Imperium and brings about a dark age of isolated or dead planets, existing in a void where no one is listening, where no one can listening. No trade, no expos, no travellers. By 1200, the situation has changed, a little. Some nearby systems have managed to reconnect, forming small pockets of interstellar civilization. Of note to the default core setting is the Dawn League, a growing union within the Old Expanses sector. The stage is set for the game by the Dawn League, deciding to take a more aggressive approach towards bringing worlds back into the fold of its own view of civilization, and thus 1201 sees our player characters as Star Vikings of the Reformation Coalition, boldly heading out into the virus-plagued wasteland space of the fallen Third Imperium to defeat technologically elevated dictators, TEDs, now primitive remnants of collapsed worlds, virus-controlled AI vampire starships, and more. The general concept was to lay down a history, to put a line in the sand between that history and the activities of the player characters going forward, and to say, have at it. To that end, very little was published for the new era that could be said to have furthered the timeline from that 1201 date. until much later, but we'll come to that. The Reformation Coalition was described in 4 volumes: Path of Tears, describing the coalition itself and outlining its personalities, worlds and methodologies; Smash and Grab, an adventure anthology to help start a Star Viking campaign; the Reformation Coalition Equipment Guide, providing, unsurprisingly, new equipment, vehicles, spacecraft and so on; and Star Vikings, a book detailing several non-player characters of the Reformation Coalition in detail. All of these volumes assume a date of 1201, if they assume a date at all. But what, you say, if you don't like this whole Star Viking thing? Well, there is, even more conveniently than existed within Mega Traveller, the eternal Spinward Marches. In this corner of the Imperium, a barrier of interdiction was thrown together before Virus could penetrate too far into the old domain of Deneb, enabling things to go on pretty much as per Classic Traveller's default setting of the Spinward Marches and Mega Traveller's domain of Deneb under the guidance of Archduke Norris. Here, the shielded subsectors known as the Regency. The Regency sourcebooks, Keepers of the Flame, and the Combat Vehicle Guide assume a date of 1202, with the easing of the shield, the quarantine, to allow ships to conditionally travel out into the wilds or into the Regency itself. The 1202 date for the Regency reflects both its later addition to the New Era works, in 1995, and that a crew travelling from the old expanses to the Spinward Marches through the treacherous wilds could take a year to get there if starting out in 1201. Interspersed within these subsettings are a handful of generic books that could be applied to both or the remnants of the Imperium in general. Aliens of the Rim describes the Hivers and the Ithcler, and was presumably intended as an initial volume in an Alien series, but this was all we ended up with on the Alien front, other than some general notes in the core rules and the occasional species cropping up elsewhere. Vampire fleets delved into Virus more, especially Virus-controlled ships. This volume also presented a connected Virus-focused campaign and design rules for robots. Yes, I am aware I haven't yet touched on design rules for anything else. Be patient. The World Tamer's Handbook describes the generation of further world details and running colonies, adding to that scope to the new era possible playstyles. Play aids in the shape of a book of forms and a referee screen were also released. Finally, 3 related but standalone games were released under the New Era banner: Striker 2, a tabletop wargame; Brilliant Lances, a ship-to-ship hex and counter game; and Battle Rider, a large vessel and fleet-based abstract starship game. Or did I say finally? I would like to make one statement before I go further. That is, Traveller, the New Era, is my favourite edition of Traveller, not to the exclusion of pretty much any other edition, and not the current edition I play, which, for the curious, is a pizza base of Mongoose Traveller 2nd Edition with toppings from Classic, T5, Mega Traveller, New Era and GURPS Traveller thrown on. Anyway, there are 2 reasons why New Era is my favourite edition. First, I like the Virus era as a setting. I like the idea of Star Vikings coaxing a wrecked universe back into some semblance of civilization. All that, to me, was pretty cool. But most of all, I like the design rules, which means I absolutely love the New Era Fire, Fusion and Steel book. So much so that I went through more than one copy of it. You see, I am a creative type. I hope you can see that from the music that's scattered across the channel. I'm also an engineer. Couple those 2 mindsets together and throw a book such as Fire, Fusion and Steel at it, and mathematical music is to be made. So, what did Fire, Fusion and Steel offer in its design sequences that previous and future editions of Traveller did not? Well, simply put, you could do anything from first principles up. From this, I mean you design a rifle from the ammunition it is to use up. You could design a starship from the absolute bare bones. You could, thanks to the expansions to Fire, Fusion and Steel in the World Tamer's Handbook, build a bow. I like bows. Bows are one of my things. Usually, Traveller design involves a bit of maths and doing a lot of piecing together the particular Lego bricks that you need from the tables presented to you for the thing you're building. Usually restricted to vehicles and starships, but certain editions also dove into weapons and other items of gear. But with Fire, Fusion and Steel, I could design several types of ammo for a specific gun. I could say, to hell with jump drives and jump into stutter warp and stargates. With these sequences and options available, I could build pretty much anything I wanted. Probably even a TARDIS, although I'd have to put my own rules together for time drives. How remiss. Given that you probably now realise that Fire, Fusion and Steel is one of my favourite books on my gaming shelves, you have to take into account one further thing. Fire, Fusion and Steel could be so detailed because the New Era rules allowed it to be. Let's take the ammo concept. Penetration, recoil, magazine capacity, load weight, all of these are calculable, game-relevant values determined by the design sequences. Anyway, I've waxed lyrical about that enough. The general ins and outs of it is that the New Era rules represent the only edition of the game that, so far, has let me do everything that I have wanted to do without too much messing around, and therefore it is my favourite. Going back to our history of Traveller, the New Era though, its release came in 1993. By 1994 we had a good mix of supplements for the Reformation Coalition and some extensions to the core base of the game. In 1995 we got the Regency and Vampire fleets, and in February 1996 Game Designers Workshop went under. But was that the end for the New Era? Well, no, not quite. Or rather, yes for the rules, but not quite for the setting. We'll come to it eventually, but as a look into the not-so-far future, QLI acquired a license to produce a D20 edition of Traveller, labelled Traveller 20 or simply T20 in 2002. Under the banner of this edition and the Open Gaming license, a small company known as Comstar Games published a handful of supplements describing a possible future look into the New Era with their 1248 line. 4 1248 supplements were produced in total from 2006 through to 2008. Out of the Darkness describes the general setting of 1248. Bearers of the Flame focused more on the Fourth Imperium, formed within Gushmeeg. The Spinwood State looks at the area of the Regency, now the Spinwood Domain, and the Freedom League, the successor to the 1248 material to the Reformation Coalition, and our beloved Star Vikings. These are enjoyable, and while I disagree on some of the projections and assumptions made to arrive at the described 1248 period from the New Era's 1201 starting point, there is nothing here defying logic, just opinion. With the closure of GDW in 1996, Traveller was about to embark on what I can only describe as a level of craziness. Up to this point, the game had a pretty much linear life path, what we now term Classic, through to Mega Traveller, to the New Era. But after this, you will have to wait and see. From an aesthetic point of view, the New Era book covers evoke a classic science fiction feel. The fonts, the colours and the space banding to the top and left do appeal to me. However, open any of them up and you are often faced with walls upon walls of text. Paragraph spacing is poor and, in some cases, finding specific rules can be an absolute chore at times. The combat section of the core rulebook is especially guilty of this, with insets used in lieu of decent paragraph spacing, and little else to delineate non-header subjects on a page. In this regard, the book could have done with a few additional pages to allow for better spacing, or perhaps dropping some of the more detailed source material and example adventures. Where the books do well are in tabulated information, which are very clear in row separation and statistic blocks for things like vehicles and starships. Where the usual hex star maps of Traveller are used, they and their attendant world data are presented in a concise and readable manner. In fact, my favourite presentation of such across Traveller editions. The Fire, Fusion and Steel book does alleviate the series presentation issues somewhat by using clear chapter markers at the page edges. This is very helpful as there can be a lot of jumping backwards and forwards when using the book's design sequences. The rules themselves are broadly more complex than Classic and Mega Traveller, or at least more detailed. I'll illustrate this by comparing two key factors of combat in all three editions: range and damage. In Classic Traveller, range is depicted in forms of range bands: close, short, medium, long and very long. These are compared back to actual measurements, but generally speaking the system concerns itself more with the relative positions between two combatants in terms of the range band abstraction. Movement, instead of being set as a number of meters per combat round, is noted in terms of range bands. A character can move towards another combatant at one range band per turn, or two if running. Of course, supplementary rules such as those found in Snapshot provide a finer granularity, but in the core game, the range bands of combatants in relation to each other is king. Range band provides a die modifier, or DM, to the attack roll based on the weapon being used. This modifier is applied to two six-sided dice roll against a fixed, mostly target number of 8. Mega Traveller covers both the range band concept and specific distances together, essentially combining Snapshot with the core classic game concepts. Characters move by squares: 1.5, 15 metres, 150 metres or 1500 metres, per variable time combat round. 6 seconds for 1.5 and 15 metre squares, 1 minute for 150 metre squares and 10 minutes for 1500 metre scale. Combatants have a speed value, which is essentially 1/10 actual velocity in kilometres per hour, from which they determine movement points depending on the scale being used. In general, 1 movement point is spent per square travelled. Range, however, is determined by range band. This can be abstracted, or it can be calculated specifically from the distance between two combatants, which is the norm here, given that movement needs to be done specifically by grid square distance, rather than by abstraction of range bands shifts as per Classic. Range and the direct fire difficulty profile table determines the difficulty of the task used to resolve the shot. Task difficulty dictates a target number required on a 2 six-sided dice roll for success. Simple 3 or more, routine 7 or more, difficult 11 or more, and formidable 15 or more. In the new era, an indoor grid of 2 metres per square and an outdoor grid of 10 metres per square are used. Movement speeds are defined specifically in metres per 5-second combat turn. At a walk, for an unburdened human, this is 10 metres, so in one combat turn, under normal circumstances, a human can cover 5 squares at the 2 metre range per turn at a walk. For range, this depends on the weapon. A weapon's short range is listed, from which its medium, double short, long, double medium, and extreme, double long range can be calculated. From there, the difficulty of the task needed to hit a target is determined by range and whether the combatant is making an aimed or a quick shot. In the new era, target numbers are set by asset, that is, a controlling attribute plus skill level, and difficulty levels provide multipliers to that target. Easy multiplies by 4, average multiplies by 2, difficult multiplies by 1, formidable by a half, and impossible by a quarter. The target is rolled using a single 20-sided dice. So that's the basics of movement and range. As you can see, the new era simplifies things from Mega Traveller, but is more complex and less abstract than Classic. So let's dive into damage. With Classic, the armour worn versus the weapon type provides a DM to the attack roll. Each weapon has a dice formula that describes its damage. The first die roll determines the damage to one of the victim's physical characteristics, strength, dexterity or endurance, determined randomly. The remaining individual die results that are applied to the physical characteristics as the victim's players determines. And that's pretty much that. On to Mega Traveller. Here, each weapon is provided a penetration and attenuation characteristic. At short range, penetration is equal to the penetration of the weapon. For every number of range bands away equal to the weapon's attenuation the target is from the attacker, penetration is halved. The calculation is continued until the weapon's maximum range is reached or the calculated penetration for that range is less than 1, i.e. rounds down to 0. Each armour type has an armour value. The weapon's final penetration for the range is compared to the armour value of the target. Weapons have a damage value. If penetration is double the armour value or higher, then the full listed damage for the weapon is inflicted. If this is equal or higher but less than double the armour value, then the weapon damage is halved. If the penetration is less than the armour value, then the damage inflicted depends on the nature of the armour. If the armour is not all-encompassing, then 1/10 of the damage is inflicted. If the armour is all-encompassing, then no damage at all is inflicted. The main differences between Mega Traveller and Classic, then, are that in Classic, damage does not change over range, and armour type contributes to the difficulty of the successful hit, while in Mega Traveller, damage is reduced over range, and armour has nothing to do with whether or not a target is successfully hit by an attack, and everything to do with how much damage a successful hit target takes. So on to the new era. Well, first, these rules require determination of the hit location struck by the attack, for humanoids, head, arms, leg, chest and abdomen. Accordingly, the armour worn at each hit location must be recorded. Armour material carries an armour value. Weapons possess from 1 to 3 penetration ratings. The first penetration rating refers to short and medium range, the second to long range, and the third to extreme range. Each weapon's damage characteristic is recorded in terms of the number of 6-sided dice that represents the weapon's full damage capacity. Penetration rating indicates the number of damage dice lost by a weapon's attack per armour value. It must penetrate at the relevant range. For example, a 9mm Magnum has a penetration of 1-0 and a damage of 2. At short and medium range, the Magnum will lose 1 damage dice per armour value struck. The armour wearing flak armour, which has an armour value of 1, over the attacked hit location would therefore block 1 die of damage from the Magnum, and 1 die would go through to injure the target. The nil value, which applies to long range for the Magnum, indicates that the weapon cannot penetrate armour at that range and beyond. The flak armour would wholly protect a target from a Magnum at long range and further, but a T-shirt would not. If the damage dice pool is reduced to 0, then the weapon fails to penetrate and the target is unharmed. Each hit location possesses a hit capacity, derived from the character's strength and constitution. Different formulae cover each location. Head is double constitution, chest is strength plus constitution multiplied by 3, and all of the other areas have strength plus constitution multiplied by 2. In addition, each hit location has a wound severity that compares back to hit capacity. Scratch is up to half hit capacity in damage, slight is up to the hit capacity value, serious is up to twice hit capacity, and critical is more than twice hit capacity. Each wound severity has an effect on the character's performance. For example, being slightly wounded reduces initiative by 1. Being seriously wounded reduces initiative by a further 2 points. Characters reduced to 0 initiative cannot act. There are even further effects of damage. A character might be knocked down if they receive more damage in a turn than their agility. They can be stunned by receiving damage to the head hit location. Serious wounds can render a character unconscious. Critical wounds can kill. Damage received to just the head or the chest can result in a quick kill, usually mitigated on behalf of player characters, that can just outright end a target's life, regardless of hit capacity. In other words, New Era combat is lethal. There are also many more factors to keep track of than in the first 2 iterations of the game, from a damage perspective. All in all, the new era provides for a more detailed look at injuries, medical care and so on, and this works well in the context of a survival game such as Twilight 2000, which is, after all, where these rules originate. And arguably, the new era setting does describe a post-apocalyptic survival setting on an interstellar scale. However, if you are more of a classic or heroic science fiction mindset, these rules may seem overly complex. These detail views cascade down to vehicular and starship combat too, particularly in the latter. Hit location and specific damage results feed into a wide variety of damage control options for starship crews, including reallocation of power between a ship's systems, fighting fires and so on. Again, in both Classic and Mega Traveller, starship combat is more abstract, even when using the Mayday board game rules. In the new era, it is more detailed, which makes for more complexity in the rules and can also feed into the role-playing narrative. This is especially true of the Brilliant Lances game. The new era's Mayday, if you will. Compare a Mayday ship record to a Brilliant Lancers one, and you will see what I mean. More simple to get a handle on, at least for me, is the abstraction that is Battle Rider. The best way to describe this game is as the new era's High Guard variant. It cuts down ship stats to a minimum, which then easily accommodate fleet manoeuvres. Now, all of this detail may or may not be for you, but it does open the door for what I see as the crowning glory of the new era set, Fire Fusion and Steel. Without the detail in the rules, a detailed technical architecture manual would not work so well, and we can see something of that effect if we skip ahead briefly to the 4th edition of Traveller. T4 has its own edition of Fire Fusion and Steel, but because the system itself is more abstract than New Era, the design sequences presented are similarly simplified and abstracted, at least more so than in New Era's Fire Fusion and Steel. Although T4's version is drawn from the concept of New Era's version, it is actually more akin to the design rules from Mega Traveller. While it is still a gearhead's gateway into Traveller, T4's version does sit under the shadow of its New Era's ancestor. That mostly covers it from a rules perspective, so how about the setting? Well, in Classic we had a relatively stable setting, with even the backdrop of the Fifth Frontier War not really changing things too much. Player characters could potter around charting trade routes, doing the odd job for patrons, and by and large keeping things local. A sector-sized area of space was pretty much all that was needed for players to sandbox in. The grand scheme of things, as far as the major interstellar polities of charted space went, was interesting background noise that could occasionally pop up during play. This changed with Mega Traveller, with those polities collapsing and actively at each other's throats, as the decline described in the Hard Times sourcebook and the broader happenings within charted space took on a new importance to the player characters. The next subsector they found themselves in might be the centre of a multi-fleet clash. The next world they visit might have collapsed to the point where the known world profile grabbed from the ship's computer bears little resemblance to the actual state of play. The setting did treat the characters a bit like leaves in the wind, however. Except for a few notable scenarios, they could do little to influence the current state of affairs. Simply react to them and make the best go of it possible. Within the new era, though, it's all change. Those world profiles in the ship's computer are definitely wrong. The default setup has players part of a group pushing back this new longish night, actively making a difference on a wider stage. It is post-apocalyptic, but it's not really so much about survival as it is about recovery, a new dawn in which the player characters are central figures. For me, this appeals. I didn't mourn the loss of the Third Imperium because I felt that the setting, while interesting and beloved, was also static and stagnant. In fact, the GURPS Traveller line, which we will cover eventually, with its base alternate timeline where the Mega Traveller Rebellion didn't take place, does illustrate this very fact. In contrast, the new era is dynamic, forward-thinking, and intriguing. Reasons for conflict are logical and real, rather than shoved under the radar of an indifferent Imperium. Surveying activities provide data critical and necessary to the broader ongoing mission, rather than keeping the Scout Service in employment in its quest to build a better Domesday Book for the Imperium. What the players find on the next world visited might be a vampire-run Matrix-style world of incubated human batteries, rather than a calculable trade hub to speculate on a spreadsheet while en route in jump space. More so than the Classic and the Mega Traveller milieus, the new era setting is an immediate, living, breathing thing. Your mileage will obviously vary, especially with a game that presents such broad possibilities as Traveller does. But from the open and dynamic setting to the detailed rules that allow for a thing of gearhead beauty that is the new era's edition of Fire Fusion and Steel, you may understand now why this is, and remains, my favourite edition of the Traveller game. That being said, it isn't always my favoured edition to pick up and play. For a fan of detail and complexity, the game sits about right on the balance between too complex and too abstract. But not everyone in our gaming circles is of that kind of mindset. It is better to set a game going with rules that appeal to the majority at the table, and in that regard, while Traveller the New Era is a great set of rules for engineers with an interest in military matters, or even individuals associated with the military that have an engineering mindset, something like Mongoose's current edition of Traveller has a broader spectrum of appeal. Traveller the New Era is a great game, but with too much of a niche appeal. The Traveller New Era core rulebook is the only absolute essential. Of course, I would add Fire Fusion and Steel too, but I don't think anyone would be surprised there. Some other worthy semi-essentials would be the World Tamer's Handbook, and if the whole Star Vikings heading out into the wilderness to restart civilization thing appeals, the Path of Tears is recommended. The Regency sourcebook is useful if you want to run a classic-esque game within the New Era setting, but to be honest, if you lean in that direction, I would suggest picking up some older and newer sourcebooks that cover the Third Imperium as a setting, and apply the New Era rules if they appeal. However, I don't think the rules do capture the feel of such a setting. Personally, if I was going to run a Third Imperium pre-collapse game, I would probably reach for Mongoose Traveller, Mega Traveller or Classic Traveller instead. The New Era rules do capture the post-collapse setting better. The associated games Brilliant Lances, Battle Rider and Striker 2 are all fun, but not essential, with one caveat. If you are designing a lot of your own starships for the New Era rules, then Brilliant Lances is absolutely essential, as the starship design sequence in that set is clearer than its presentation within Fire Fusion and Steel, mostly because it hasn't got to delve into as many details and alternate technologies as the latter book. And don't forget, most of the Twilight 2000 2nd edition releases are directly compatible with the New Era rules. That is, if you find yourself in need of a lot of Tech Level 8 or 9 military weapons and vehicles, your quid's in. Traveller the New Era is a good game, unfortunately hampered by its appeal by the amount of errata it generated, its sometimes eye-watering wall of text presentation, and detailed rules. It is one of those love it or hate it systems, what we like to call the Marmite effect in the UK. But if you are a natural gearhead with an eye for detail and a scope that can open up with the game systems, then Traveller the New Era is certainly worth a look. So that's been my look at my personal favourite version of Traveller, its third incarnation as the New Era. Next up on the Traveller scale will be its fourth edition, which followed the closure of Game Designers Workshop. Now that the fourth edition of Twilight 2000 is out into the wild, a review of that game and its earlier incarnations is on the slate. Having done my top Dungeons & Dragons adventures, I'm going to revisit that list style of video with the bottom worst adventures for that game. I'm also experimenting with ideas for putting some solo playthroughs up for Tunnels and Trolls, Solo Quest and others. Another thing that's been suggested is a sort of playthrough tutorials or how to play on classic old adventures. And even some new ones, just to explore, break new Dungeon Masters in and give other people my thoughts on how to actually play rather than giving overviews of those adventures. So that'll be fun to explore. Apart from that, the usual mix of music and other random subjects, which may or may not be your own personal tastes, but hopefully you'll find something entertaining on the way. So farewell, until the next one.